Okay, let's start the evening. Welcome, René. Welcome everyone who is present now. I will introduce the talk. I'm Thierry Berlemont. So I invited or took the initiative to invite Failed Architecture. I think René is a kind of a spokesperson for failed architecture. And he and me agreed that I will not introduce him, nor will I introduce failed architecture as such. What I will try to do is provide some clarity on why I considered it important to give them the forum here this evening. There is more than one reason, but I will limit myself to only two of them. Otherwise, it would be too long. And it's maybe also important to say that it's my personal reading, which means that my personal reading may diverge from what those involved in failed architecture actually want to do. So that we will see that later on. So let's start. Failed architecture is a platform for architectural critique. It provides opportunities for multiple voices to express themselves. It enables them to contribute to shared aspiration, that is, to improve architecture. Many people from multiple places around the world are involved, and the emphasis lies on collective or congregational agency rather than the individual version of it. In practice, it can also be seen as one of the available antidotes to the individualism in which architecture has been soaked up for so long, way too long, if you ask me. Besides, there is the noteworthy presence of the concept failure, which is an interesting concept, if you ask me. The term failure is most often used or applied after the facts. Something has been done that appears not to work, to be wrong or inadequate. The aim that was set beforehand has not been reached or backfired. On top of that, there usually is a connected tendency to point the finger at those who are supposedly responsible for the miscarriages and deficiencies. Failure in this sense is oriented backwards to the past where the actions leading up to the failure happened. Within the framework of failed architecture, there seems to be something more at stake. Failure is not merely a negative culmination of what happened before. It rather works as a flashlight that points at issues where some learning has to be done. It is a way to increase awareness about non-intended and non-anticipated outcomes and the necessity to find ways for addressing them. In so doing, failure becomes a place to start from rather than an end point. In my opinion, it is here that failed architecture makes valuable contribution, namely orienting failure towards a future instead of the past. The failed situations become a kind of ground zero where a thoughtful process of modification, repair, development of alternatives, and improvement can start. In so doing, it associates failure with an unwavering belief that the future can be better. In short, for me, it is optimism. So, René, thank you for being here, for sharing your precious time with us. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say about failed architecture. The floor is yours. So.
Thank you so much, Jerry. I just had to change microphones. So I'm just wondering, can you hear me well? We didn't test this. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Really happy to be here today. Thanks all for joining. I'm talking to you from a new office we have in the former French Institute in central Amsterdam. And yeah, very excited to do this lecture with you today. I'm going to share my screen and we tested it, so I hope it works. Before I start, can somebody give a confirmation that it's actually working indeed?
It works.
Yeah, okay, that's wonderful.
Yes.
Okay,
Well,
please.
here it works.
Great, yeah. And please interrupt me if there is some technical issues or if you can't hear me anymore. And yeah, maybe you can also ask questions. I mean, how would you, Jerry, maybe you have an idea about that. Can people interrupt me or would you like to collect them first?
Well, my preference is that you get the time to say what you have to say. And then we will, after that, we will talk. I think it's better not to interrupt too much, to keep the flow.
Good, yeah. Okay, let's do it like that. All right, wonderful. Okay, let me start then. Yeah, so my name is René Boer. I'm an independent critic, curator and organizer, working in and beyond the fields of architecture, art, design, and heritage. I'm based between Amsterdam and Cairo, Egypt, my second hometown. And I'm one of the driving forces behind Field Architecture, together with many others. I was one of the organizers for a long time, but over the last year, I'm slowly working my way out, handing over to a new generation. And yeah, so Jerry asked me to talk about field architecture today, which I will do. And field architecture is basically an international platform for critical urban discourse. And it's led by a group of spatial critics, as we call them, or even spatial activists, maybe in many cases. And today I will explain a bit about how field architecture came into being, how it developed over the last decade or so, but also especially how some of its perspectives on many things have been changing actually and shifting over in recent times. I will also highlight the importance of independent criticism, especially when it comes to architecture and spatial production. And to close off, I would actually like to open up a space to collectively discuss with all of you present here today, to discuss potential pathways for the future of architecture criticism in general, but maybe also field architecture in particular, as we also see it as a common resource that is available to, let's say, a new generation of spatial experts. So I guess most of you present here today. All right, let me begin actually with explaining how field architecture emerged. And it all started with this building on the Wieboudstraat, just to the southeast of Amsterdam's city center. Used to be a former printing plant from the Trouw newspaper for many decades. This building was originally designed by Van den Broek and Bakema, a modernist building that for many years was the place where this newspaper was actually written to some extent and also printed and then distributed, very close to an historical urban core. And in 2005, this building became empty after the editorial board moved out, and actually the printing presses were also removed, and then it was empty for a long time before a small group of people started to develop it into a club, a restaurant, and also a cultural venue, an event space. And very soon this actually became a famous club, people coming in from around Europe with buses to join the parties that were going on there in the weekends. And some of us were also asked to start a series of conversations and debates about this building and also about what was going on there at the moment and about this transformation that was going on. And we started this series of conversations, and I think a lot of this immediately raised a lot of questions, like why is this building empty for such a long time? Will it ever be used again as a printing plant? Can it ever be used again in that way? What does it mean that it has been abandoned and that it's currently being transformed? What is actually the impact of this transformation? But one of the core questions was also like, does it amount to being a failure that this building has been abandoned, and that like across the Netherlands and across Europe, this kind of buildings, this kind of modernist buildings are being abandoned. And while we were having these conversations, new plans were released. What would happen with this building? It would be, the plan was to demolish it and to actually build this instead. relatively expensive residential apartments with leaving no trace of what was there before. But I think at the time we were still in the middle of the crisis, so very soon these plans were also cancelled, and then it was like silent for a long time. But then a new plan was made to develop the entire printing plant complex into a so-called student hotel. And I think you also have student hotel in Belgium. And this is definitely not your average dorm. This is like a high-end for-profit student accommodation with a lot of facilities on site. And this is actually also what's materialized in the end. And this is the current state still today. And on the top floor of the tower on the left hand, you also have like the most expensive student apartments in this entire complex right now. They're called the Panorama Executive Student Apartments, and prices start at €1,400 a month. And in an ironic twist, the restaurant on the ground floor is called The Commons, but definitely not accessible to all students, I would say. So this is what happened to this very specific location. And of course, we're already, like when we were in the building having these conversations, this didn't happen yet, but we had already some idea of what was going to happen. And of course, this also fueled more of the debates, like what do these plans mean? And is this kind of development in this kind of, let's say, for-profit, unaffordable to most students kind of student accommodation, with the government not providing any affordable student accommodation at all, isn't this the big failure that is going to happen still? So these were many of the conversations that we were having at the time. And we started to upload some of these debates on a very simple Tumblr page, and it looked more or less like this. I was looking it up the other day. And also later a simple website. And somehow these debates kind of resonated, so it started to become very popular, also this Tumblr page. And we started to upload some of the debates that we're having in the building, but also other articles and conversations on vacant buildings, vacancy, abandoned buildings, ruins, all kinds of dystopia, and especially a lot about this notion of failure. And I think what is interesting is that failure really stayed with us as a notion, which it's still in the name, of course. But what is important is that it really, I think, and Jerry already mentioned that, it really it started and has always been kind of a question mark, like a starting point for critical debate and never a final verdict. So it was never the case that we would go somewhere or enter debate with the already concluded outcome that this is a failure or not. So it's always like a starting point for debate. What is interesting though, I think reflecting about this 10 years later, is also, and I think this is important to mention, that like these themes and these discussions were brought up by a very diverse group of young people who were interested in these themes, but in the end that they were also dominated by 4 white, relatively privileged young men for whom these themes were also like kind of easy material to discuss and to toy around with and even to make fun of. And I think for none of them, including myself, it was not a life-shaping experience to live in conditions that can be regarded as failure. So I think this is an important reflection, like 10 years later, that it's important, like who brings these themes up and who talks and who gets to talk about it, and for whom is it easy to talk about these kind of things. And yeah, for example, I came across this specific page on the website and like a reflection, or I think an announcement of this debate called Ruin Porn, the Beauty of Failure. And I think again here, the fact that failure is being embraced as something that is beautiful, I think is already interesting and maybe even problematic, looking at it from hindsight. And I think also the term ruin porn, very interesting, has been used to refer to, let's say, the aestheticization of decay for some immediate kind of visual satisfaction rather than an actual engagement with what's going on. And I think already in this debate, we were critical of this term, but still we're using it and using it to attract an audience. And I think, yeah, it's important to reflect on that many years later. And however, I think what was interesting is that from the start on, it is not that we did not want to engage with these specific things we're talking about. I think we're immediately interested also in contextualizing these very specific cases that we came across. And So we started to talk a lot about, let's say, the architectural historical context. I think we started to reflect a lot on modernist architecture in particular, which was at the time going through this wave of reappreciation after being out of vogue for many decades. I think many modernist buildings were at a point where they were at the end of a cycle. Many of them were like in a bad shape and about to be demolished. And I think there were cases, and I think this is still going on right now, cases around Europe and around the world in which these buildings were being demolished. So they often ended up in our conversations. But it was not just modernism. I think we started to, about many of these so-called cases of failure, we started to reflect on, let's say, the social, economic, and political context. So this was, on the one hand, we started to contextualize it, but on the other hand, what was interesting is that we started to share all these reflections also on social media, which was still quite new at the time, mostly Facebook. It looked more or less like this at the time. It's interesting actually that we still have screenshots now too. It's also, I think, an interesting documentation of the project. But so what is interesting is that through Facebook, I think part of the rapid growth of failed architecture really worked also through this kind of aestheticized image of modernist architecture, of these remarkable ruins. So on the one hand, we wanted to contextualize it, but on the other hand, the growth was fueled also through the aestheticization of these kind of conversations. And I will reflect a bit more on this and this later. Later, we improved the website and continued to expand on many of these themes. This is an article that we wrote for actually about also some of the years that we spent in that building and some of the conversations that we had there. And I think as the failed architecture project, the social media channels and the website started to gain more traction and became more popular, at some point we were asked to do workshops about other buildings, not just the Trouw building in central Amsterdam, but also buildings in other places. And I will show a few examples which I found interesting. This is in Rapla near Tallinn, Estonia, and this is a cultural center that was built in the 70s, late 70s, when it was still a Soviet country, Estonia. And this was the cultural center that was built for this small community. It was also a small sporting venue. It was the place where cultural events would take place. Actually, not for so many years, for maybe around 15 years into the fall of the wall and the end of the Soviet regime. And then ever since this building has remained empty. And so I think when we did this workshop, actually in this case, it was one of the first times it actually reopened. We stayed in the building together with a group of students and people from the community for more than a week. And as it appeared, I think a lot of people in the community actually had very fond memories of this building and would really rather see it reopened. And also the students, I think a new generation also start to reappreciate kind of the often tainted leftovers from the Soviet times. And together, very quickly, after doing some research throughout this week, plans were made to reopen it. So failure here as a starting point for a conversation, but definitely not as the end. In the end, it was also more of a reappreciation of what can still be done with such a building. And a very similar kind of conversation actually emerged here. This is in Sharjah, one of the United Arab Emirates, not very far from Dubai. And what you see here, this row of modernist housing in the back is so-called Bank Street, which was constructed after oil was found in or near Sharjah, and money started to flow in. So you have to imagine that Sharjah originally was like a small fishing village on the coast, not necessarily very wealthy. But when money started to flow in, very soon this kind of modernist office buildings were being constructed, and they were still standing there until a few years ago. And also here we were invited by a museum to do a workshop on this kind of on Bank Street, on the specific buildings. And what we found out when we're doing the workshop together, also with students from a local university mostly, is that the museum was actually also very closely connected to a project to actually demolish these buildings and to rebuild the original fishing village as some kind of 1001 night, 1001 Arabian Night kind of tourist development. and that they actually had a stake in also getting these things demolished and having them branded as some kind of failure. But interestingly, during the workshop, the opposite happened. Like students actually start to talk to the mostly migrant Indian and Pakistani community that now lives in these former office buildings, and actually have created a really vibrant and exciting kind of neighborhood in a city that is mostly like very suburban and very car oriented, as you can also see partly in this image. And this new generation, a young generation of young Emiratis interested in architecture, actually vocalized their appreciation also of this kind of architecture, and during the workshop started to print t-shirts with like this kind of silhouette of these buildings on it. And this started to really annoy the museum that was hosting the entire workshop, to the point that they said like, well, guys, maybe you have to stop now because it's enough. But again, I think an interesting kind of turnaround happened during this workshop. Unfortunately, these buildings have now been demolished, and they're in the process of rebuilding the fishing village, which are also going to apply to UNESCO, interestingly. And we still have to see what's coming out of that. But later we also start to do these field architecture workshops on more contemporary architecture. Here you can see the Dongdaemun Design Plaza, designed by Zaha Hadid, constructed in Seoul, South Korea, on top of a very large informal market that has been forcibly removed to make sure that this design plaza could be constructed. And together with a group of students, we got lost in the endlessly like flowing waves and shapes of this building. And what's interesting, there's actually not so much on the inside other than gift stores. So it's there is not much going on. It's mostly a very Instagrammable building. I think here the students very soon stayed with their verdict that this building should maybe not have been constructed on top of an important informal part of the city. So I think as field architecture continued to grow, I think we always stayed with this notion of failure. It's a kind of a maxim, a kind of a provocation. I think that always worked as a powerful Kickstarter of discussions. And somehow it also resonates in many ways with people. I think that it has partly to do with the fact that we're still in a society that is focused on success, and that failure is some kind of uncomfortable thing that should maybe not happen or should not exist. And being confronted with it kind of triggers all kinds of thoughts, and is in that sense also very productive. And obviously also, I think what you see here in the image is obviously the Tower of Babel, a very important cultural reference point in the end. That architecture projects started with too much confidence will in the end maybe all fail. So I think this is maybe what a lot of people have in their in the back of their heads maybe. And maybe it also resonates because still I think today a lot of people are used to see cities and architecture often represented as a failure. And even though these are often huge simplifications of reality, you know, I will give a few examples. Let's, for example, talk about the many cities that have gone through like economic difficulty. And here you see like one photo from a photo series about Detroit that has gone through a very difficult period. Is now going slightly better, of course, but is often represented as this total failure through this kind of images that can be classified as indeed as ruin porn. And another kind of representation that you often see are, of course, let's say the extreme images of slum-like conditions that indeed exist around the world. But this kind of image, and here you see a photo from still from Slumdog Millionaire, of course, a film that's further solidified this like extreme kind of imagery around slum-like conditions that are often a huge simplification of what's actually going on. And another kind of such representation, I think is happening often when it comes to informal architectures. And here you see a well-known situation of a tower in Caracas, also known as the Torre David, which was supposed to be a skyscraper for, let's say, I think for a bank. But in the end, the project was abandoned and it was squatted by a large group of people who turned it into this vertical community. This vertical city with not just houses, but also shops and like all kinds of services. And there was no elevator. So it was this, to move around in this vertical city was quite a struggle, I guess. But again, this is something like this specific kind of representation is what you is what kind of people are used to, also this kind of oversimplifications. And this is also something that happens a lot with modernist architecture that I already touched upon briefly. And here you see the Pruitt-Igoe estate in St. Louis in the United States. At the moment, it was demolished in 1971 after only having existed for 14 years. And this has been branded, this specific moment, the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing estate has been branded as the official death of modernism. And I think here we see again like how the story of this estate has been simplified in many ways, that it was modernism didn't work and therefore at some point it had to be demolished. And I think there's a really beautiful movie that we have screened often and I really recommend watching, is the Pruitt-Igoe myth, which kind of counters this very simplified kind of image. It actually shows how the buildings were never maintained after construction, how they dumped people with a lot of social problems in this area without actually taking care that any kind of social fabric would emerge. So there were a lot of reasons why this was a problematic area. And rather than actually solving these problems, the only things that did is to demolish it, kick the people out. And nowadays it's still actually a piece of grass where nothing happens. So I think this movie in an interesting way counteracts some of these oversimplification. And that's something that we also try to do, by writing about these kind of topics and discussing them, trying to scratch beyond the surface of these simplifications and to provide more contextualization of what was going on with these kind of simplifications of failure. But then over time, we also start to engage more and more with contemporary architecture, and then specifically the hyper-positivity that often surrounds contemporary architecture. And we feel that there's often this obsession with the initial design of a building or that glorious moment of its conception, and less often, almost never, the actual realization of a building or the implications for the wider urban fabric or the wider surrounding society, or let alone the afterlife of such a building. So here you see the Tre Torri project in Milan. And I think this image has been circulating a lot, but like very much less is known about what actually happened with these buildings and how they have been embedded in Milan as a city. And here you see like these three towers. I think the one on the left is designed by Zaha Hadid, the one in the middle by Libeskind, and the one on the right by Isozaki. And I think conversations that we had also, that we often have around these kind of images is about what we call render culture, in which the architect almost becomes the makeup artist only of the investment spreadsheet that is in the end at the basis of this kind of developments. And sometimes it seems that architecture is being reduced to just the production of these kind of glitzy, shiny images of just these profitable real estate projects, showing these kind of silverish boxes that are often unrelated to everything. And maybe I'm a bit pushing it here, but I think this kind of critique on what architecture has become, I think is and remains very important. And we often kind of collect these kind of renderings and trying to push a little bit back against this kind of culture that is so dominant in architecture. And here you see the winning entry of the competition for a new Guggenheim in Helsinki. And in the end, 1,700 architecture firms participated in this competition, all coming up with original designs, all putting their labor, their unpaid labor in this process. And in the end, this image actually won, still like kind of hidden between the clouds. And the saddest thing is that in the end, they canceled the entire project and none of the 1,700 entries have been built. Bringing it closer to home, my home in this case, is Hotel Jakarta, which is now built, but was originally released as this image, announced as this image. It's built on a small island just behind Central Station in Amsterdam. And again, like announcing an urban development, a spatial development that is important for a city, that is very centrally located, but just releasing this image that gives no clue how it will be related to the surrounding urban fabric what yet another hotel will do to a city that is already drowning in tourism. And again, just relying on, yeah, let's say the shape of a bit of glass with a cloud reflecting on it. And we often discuss how all of these kind of images are endlessly being uploaded and shared from like these kind of streams like ArcDaily and Architizer, where they function as some kind of endless kind of architectural eye candy. There we say archi-porn, in which these kind of in these kind of platforms that are like constantly reproduce these kind of press releases without any kind of critical side notes. And if we're pushing it a little bit, we feel that this kind of architectural production of and visualizations are still dominating the field and still dominating the discourse in many different ways. And there is still also, like in regular mainstream media, there's very little critical discourse around this kind of architectural production. So what we try to do is to dismiss the slum porn, the ruin porn, and the archi porn at the same time, and dig deeper behind these kind of obvious failures. What led to the situation? What is happening with this failure on the ground? Are there other perspectives to look at it? But at the same time, also hold up a mirror to this hyper-positivism that still dominates contemporary architecture. Which is maybe actually a failure in itself, right? And we try to contribute to undermining maybe even this kind of this hyper-positivism by maybe discussing and asking people like, what will this building actually really look like? And do we really want our cities to become like this? And maybe just to show you some examples. So here you see the website actually as it was being upgraded later on with an article from my colleague, Mark Minkjan, who wrote about this new project that is currently almost finished. It's called The Valley, designed by MVRDV. It's being constructed in Amsterdam's central business district, the Zuidas. And as Mark was saying, like nobody will ever see this building like this. So it's just an image to sell it. Nobody will see the trees grown on this building like this. Nobody will ever see this kind of building in this Mediterranean glow that doesn't exist in Amsterdam. And nobody will ever see it from this vantage point, namely the boardroom of the ABN AMRO Bank, which has its offices in a tower next door. And they're the only ones who can see it from this point of view. Other people will see it in the rain from the pavement from below. So we try to provide, let's say, more critical 360 degrees kind of understanding of these spaces being created by architecture and urbanism now and in history, and taking, let's say, the political, social, and economical and cultural context into account, and try to understand how these contexts develop over time and how these impact the production of space, its perceptions, and its representations. So basically, we try to produce a form of nuanced space criticism, or sometimes also not so nuanced if that's necessary. We continue to write about these topics today. I think this is an interesting article that is about a new project by OMA in Stockholm that is in the end a luxury apartment building, a luxury high-rise, but it's using these kind of modernist or even brutalist kind of aesthetics to grey-wash itself, let's say, in the social values that are often still associated with modernism. Or going back to, let's say, the failures. I think this is a beautiful story about a situation that happened in Rome, in which a new plant was being built, a new factory on the eastern outskirts of the city. But then they made a construction mistake, which led to an enormous lake that kind of flowed the entire site and the entire building. The construction process was abandoned. It remained like this, it became overgrown, but then later it was squatted by the nearby communities who made a hole in the wall that was surrounding the site. And they squatted it and they turned it into a cultural center, which still is today a very important neighborhood center in that part of Rome, Italy. And again, interesting here to provide some nuance to, let's say, the images that have been shared a lot of this project and really tell the complete story. Or, for example, I think this is also a very interesting article about a counter-preservation in Berlin, where actually this kind of ruinesque kind of conditions are also being used to push back against gentrification in some parts of the city. So I think what was interesting is that somehow the images that we were critiquing and trying to contextualize also at the same time continue to resonate on social media and online, and also continue to generate clicks. And so at the same time, the image that we were trying to criticize, or we were criticizing, were at the same time still also fueling the growth of field architecture. I think that's a complicated paradox that we haven't solved yet. But at the time, a few years ago, we tried to solve with the introduction of a new podcast. And with this podcast, we hoped to force ourselves to talk about all these issues in detail. So we started to develop these 1-hour audio documentaries around all kinds of topics. And at the same time try by doing that actually go beyond, let's say, the easy sharing of these kind of images. And in the end, we did make some small let's say trailers to still attract people to actually then listen to these podcasts. And this is the announcement, for example, about one of the episodes that is about like a modernist high-rise called Kleiburg in the Bijlmer neighborhood in Amsterdam. That was actually where the original people were actually removed, and it was then being branded as some kind of self-built, self-constructing place where people could buy an apartment and then really renovate it. And so it brought in a completely new class that was kind of attracted by the aesthetics of this modernism. Or this episode, which I really like, which is about Calais, and which really seeks to go beyond, let's say, these endless images of the informal architecture that is being constructed by the migrants and the refugees who are stuck in Calais, and actually turn it around. Instead of looking at that kind of architecture, look at the architecture of the border landscape of Calais, which is the actual architecture that is being constructed and is actually at the core of the violence that is taking place in Calais. So then we're talking about the wall, the fences, the police stations that are being built there. And so over time, I think we started to slowly also expand on some of the topics that we started to talk about originally, and let's say casting the net a bit wider, include other topics as well. And I think some of the interesting things that I really enjoyed reading and editing were, among others, like these articles about, for example, the impact of the data, all the new data centers that are being constructed everywhere. The fact that people often see the internet as some kind of lightweight cloud, but actually is a really heavy physical kind of impact on our urban environments in many cases. We've been writing a lot about and publishing a lot about the climate crisis as well, and how architects and the field of architecture has been responding to that, sometimes in very problematic ways as well. And this is also an article that I really enjoyed that we published a few years ago, which tries to expand in an almost spiritual way about the notion of embodied energy, which is obviously often used when it comes to sustainability, but in this case actually tries to understand also all the labor by people that has gone into materials and by default, and also into buildings, and actually tries to see materials and then buildings also as this kind of spiritual assemblage of all these kind of acts of labor by people. And so after a few years, and I think like a few years ago, we started to feel also some kind of distance to the fact that we're like constantly broadcasting, constantly like publishing this endless amount of online content. And we also at the same time also felt a need to include a wider range of people from different kind of backgrounds, also to diversify the kind of content and perspectives that were being highlighted on field architecture. And we started by doing that by launching an open call for new editors, to which we got like hundreds of new applications, which was kind of overwhelming. And at the same time, we were also thinking about a new format that we wanted to try with field architecture. So rather than being than writing and using photography to promote a certain article, or rather than a podcast, we wanted to bring the debates and conversations back to the actual places where these debates are actually important. So so actually make sure that debates take place in the location that is important to that specific conversation. And we call this the so-called situations, field architecture situations. And we wanted to move from, let's say, the image to intimacy, as we call it, and make sure that these conversations are being actually held in real life with people, and that people also get to embody the conversations that we try to promote. So what we then try to do with all the applications that we got is, rather than getting individual people on board, isolated behind their screens far away, is to actually see in what cities where we got applications from, where we could make like clusters and form small teams. And in the end, we opened 4 new bases or satellites in Beirut, Bogota, Istanbul, and New York, where we now have like small teams. And the idea was also that these teams would start working with this new format, the situations format, to rather than just producing new content for the website, also started to create like new forms of movement, new forms of engagement on site in the cities where people were based. And all of this was lined up and planned in March 2020. And like a week later, the pandemic hit and all these ideas were shelved, which was a real pity, I think. But at the same time, what it allowed us to do is to have a lot of conversations and also check in more directly as people started to be more used to these kind of, let's say, all these kind of Zoom conversations. It was more easy also to check in across all these different cities and across these different teams, and really start working together towards turning field architecture into a horizontal movement. So really go beyond this idea of, let's say, these collectives of a few dudes hanging out in Amsterdam, to a horizontal movement that really is more representing of a wider range of people. So I think at this point, field architecture is, for example, majority women, near majority of color, and also near majority queer, which I think is quite a transformation of what it used to be before. And here you see a schedule of how field architecture is currently organized. Within the middle, a new role for free organizers. So rather than the more traditional system of, let's say, an editor-in-chief or a managing editor, we're now working with free organizers. We're kind of like moving around to bring all the different teams together and have a more horizontal relation also to the different teams. So there's no, let's say, hierarchical ranking anymore. So over time, we're moving from, let's say, being more critical and ironic observers as an outsider. I think we're also more taking a position in what we see as a growing spatial movement. So let's say a global movement of people who are engaging critically and reflecting on space, not necessarily from a specific professional kind of background, but also from a very immediate and often activist background. And we try to more and more to implicate ourselves within this movement. And I think this is really a new tendency, a new way that we're moving to. And a few things that we're doing in this context is often trying to amplify critical call-outs that are happening. There are many examples, but here this one I thought was really important and really interesting. It was a call-out by the Funambulist, a Paris-based collective and magazine, very interesting project as well. And what they did is, when it was announced that Jean Nouvel would revitalize the Kasbah of Alger, they did this call out in which they said, like, maybe it's not so good idea that again, somebody from France is coming in Alger to redesign some of the vernacular architectures that still exist there. And they did this call out, which actually led to an interesting conversation, and actually in the project being postponed right now. Another really relevant and beautiful project is the Building Workers Unite, which was started by Charlie Clemos from Field Architecture. And it tries to address the production process that goes on behind the architectural facade and all the kind of labor that goes into architecture. And at the same time, trying to maybe put, let's say, the architectural labor of the architects and the designers and put that in the same kind of category as the other kinds of labor, for example, by construction workers, and put that together, and also try to think of ways how to organize new forms of solidarity between these very different kinds of labors, but ultimately part of the same kind of economic situation, and try to think of new ways to build new bridges there. And this has been one of the new special series that goes very much in depth with podcasts and articles and highlights many of these kind of topics around labor conditions in architecture and spatial production. I think this was also a very interesting moment that happened last year. This has been a collaboration with Migrants Bureau, the Designers Protest Collective, and Black Females in Architecture. And what happened last year when the Black Lives Matter movement really gained global prominence is that a lot of, as you might have seen, architecture and design firms and organizations started to put these kind of black squares on their social media, often with some very general statement. And 1 year later, or actually right when this happened, together with these other collectives, one of the field architecture teams started to document which organizations have done which statements with which kind of black squares, and also especially what kind of promises have been made, and trying to follow up with that later and really try to work with these different kinds of architecture firms and organizations to actually make sure that these promises are also being implemented. At the same time, we also continue to produce pieces of architectural criticism. And I think more and more we're also focusing on, let's say, architecture's complicitness in all kinds of power structures. I think that is reflected well, for example, in this piece that I wrote last year about a detention center near Rotterdam airport. And I didn't write this piece when it was opened 10 years ago, but actually 10 years later. And reflecting on, let's say, the architecture firm EGM Architects, which is this kind of middle of the road architecture firm in the Netherlands, who normally builds also like hospitals and schools, and seems to be very acceptable, but at the same time also builds this kind of prison facilities that over the last 10 years had like a really terrible human rights track record with forced deportations of children, but also multiple suicides taking place here, and many other kinds of really terrible situations. And trying, in this case, we're also not just publishing this in this article, but also trying, in hindsight, also to hold architects accountable in this case for what they did, and hoping really to prevent other architecture firms not to engage in these forms of carceral architectures. And at the same time, also stand with social movements in the Netherlands and elsewhere that are fighting against the construction of this kind of carceral spaces. So yeah, maybe I'll just quickly go back. So I think what is interesting is that over time, also our perspective on failure has also kind of shifted, and it's still in our name, and I think it's still also a provocative kind of starting point. But we won't as easy embrace failure as we did in the beginning, or as how we brought it, like terms like productive dystopia or the value of failure or the poetry of decay, I think we now regard as problematic and we don't want to use anymore. And I think we have been shifting more towards the importance of remembering failure. And I think this is an interesting shift. So like when certain power dynamics lead to spatial situations that induce human suffering, as for example, in this kind of context, we don't want to embrace this kind of failure, but make sure that we keep remembering the failure that has been going on, to make sure that it becomes productive in the sense that we will be reminded, and also we make others remind of the fact that this actually happened. And maybe this works also in another way, in the sense that that we should be reminded of the fact that the dominant political and economic system is actually maybe very fragile. So this fancy new built neighborhood that might be constructed near where you are also might turn into an abandoned ruin in the economic crisis of 2022, right? And we should remember that this failure already happened before and might actually happen again, and actually be ready for such a moment. And I think this can and should be the role of architecture criticism. So rather than just uncritically like celebrating the newest skyscrapers. And I think it's also important that this kind of reflection and this kind of criticism is independent. And that's also why we developed this model. So rather than putting things on behind the paywall, which of course also valid, we always try to keep all the podcast, all the situations, and all the articles make sure that they remain free. But we ask people to make monthly donations, which is actually something that has brought in a considerable amount of money. I don't think it's the amount of money that will make sure that we can pay people proper salaries for the time they actually put in field architecture. But we can compensate people for the articles that they write. We can provide a fee, but we can also provide the editors a fee for actually participating and actually making sure that these articles are being published. And by doing so, we try to sustain independent criticism that is really independent of everything else, try to sustain independent voices. But what I think is important, and that's something I always like to highlight, also especially in the context of an educational context, is that with this way of working, we also really want to sustain independent practices. So try to make sure that people people who work within field architecture or contributing to field architecture can make sure that they can actually continue to create a practice that is critical and confrontational and complicated, can continue to do so without having to work for an institution or having to work for an architecture firm. So really also try to contribute to the independence of the people that we work with, and also for ourselves. And maybe it's also good to, I hope this is also an interesting reminder that this is also maybe for all of you. I mean, you might be aspiring to work in an architecture firm, but it's also possible to create your own critical kind of practice and sustain it on the long term. And maybe I would like to leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, René. It's a very full subject. I mean, where you go in many directions. Also, probably a difficult thing to communicate within this kind of format, because it has a kind of intrinsic depth and complexity, which I think is how to say it, which is difficult to convey somehow. Good. I would like to open the floor for questions to the audience. Is there someone who has a question already, or wants to intervene, or a comment, or whatever? Please do so. In the meantime, to start the game, our dean was also present, and he has put 3 questions in the Q&A. I will put them forward in the order that I think is maybe most activating somehow. One of the questions is you have the criticism and workshops and so forth, which is kind of maybe the term is not really adequate, but the kind of positioning from the outside, looking at the problem. And how do you connect that with the activism on site, the occupations, the sit-ins, the squats, and so forth? Is there a connection or not? Or do you aim at these kind of things too?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, thanks. Interesting question. I think in the end, we want to stay with criticism, and let's say, the reflection, the criticism comes first, I think. And maybe also to get back to what you said in your introduction, that in the end, there is some optimism around it. I think I really like it that you read it like that, but at the same time, I think we really chose never to go into very specific solutions or in actual engagements, I think. So we always try to stay on, let's say, the critical often also cynical, reflectionist kind of side, and really leave it to others to then bring it to bring it into, let's say, a productive next step. And maybe also when it's in terms of the activism, I think we want to stay on the reflection and on the side of the campaign. So, for example, in this case of Jean Nouvel working on the Kasbah of Alger, bringing forward this criticism that the fact that it maybe should not be done, but then I mean, it would, of course, Alger is also far, but like not go into an actual activist proposition on the side, I think.
Yes, then, well, for me, you raise another question there, because there is this kind of voicing of a critique. Do you have the feeling that critique in its many forms that you articulate on the platform is also being heard and taken seriously, in the sense that that it's like being brought into the game afterwards by others, so to speak, to indeed formulate these other these kind of future-oriented proposals?
Yes, super interesting question. Yeah, it's a good, and I wonder if that's the case actually. So we know that there is a large readership. We know that architects are circulating a lot, that they're being debated a lot. But for example, in the case of this detention center in Rotterdam, the architects, EGM architects, have never responded to this specific to the article, have never wanted to engage, have never replied to our emails. So I think it's they never engaged in the debate, but what we hope is that it would prevent other architecture firms from engaging in such kind of commissions and projects. And yeah, we can never know whether they indeed did not participate in something. But so it's hard to say. I mean, we know that the debate and the conversations resonate, but whether the actual impact in, let's say, policy circles, but also in architecture firms making certain choices, that's to be debated. And yeah, it would be interesting to think of maybe some kind of impact assessment or something.
Well, I think it's a difficult issue, because maybe, like you said, it's formulating the well, kind of creating a context for questioning. Maybe maybe that's also a good way to look at it, in the sense that, and in that sense, the example that you gave about Jean Nouvel, what I could read about it on the slide is that kind of a letter or something. Well, Jean Nouvel was addressed.
Yeah. In that case, he responded, actually.
Yes, and did that lead to something?
Well, he said, like, I don't care, I'm still going to do it. And then there was another letter in response to that. And I think the entire project is now on hold. So it's a bit unclear whether he made a certain decision, or that maybe others made a certain decision based on the public pressure that was being created from a lot of sides. So, I mean, it's also, again, I think, difficult to measure the actual impact here.
Yeah, but the kind of response somehow underscores the kind of arrogance that you also have in the imagery that sells the project.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, there is someone having a question. I can't do that here, but the people in the back office, so to speak, can give them the micro or the floor. It's Uria. Inge, can you do that, or Mumtaz?
Normally she can talk if she
Okay.
wants.
Then she needs to do it. Oria, you have a microphone and a camera. Yes.
She says that she thinks that she's a problem, so maybe she can type
Yeah,
it
but
later.
then maybe she can type her question in the Q&A and it can be addressed.
It's not her. Yeah.
Our dean also asked, and maybe I am not sure based on what you already answered, whether that is a question that is either relevant or maybe answerable. Do you have a definition, description, or whatever of failed architecture? What is an interesting failure and an uninteresting failure? I'm not sure what he means by that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that is really hard to answer. I mean, as I said, I think for us, the failure is kind of more a starting point for a conversation and not some kind of final verdict. So I think, I mean, I think what we hope is that in larger conversations, this kind of reflection and maybe some kind of verdict also emerges in collectivity, right? And I think the author is contributing to failed architecture can contribute to this kind of reflections and valuations, but I don't think there's a fixed definition or description of failure. I mean, it comes in so many ways, right? It can be like a very specific economic failure, a social failure. It can have like a political kind of background. So there's many different kind of ways in which things can fail. And again, then on the notion of it being interesting or not, I think that's something that we also try to abandon a little bit, as I said. So this idea that it's interesting to reflect on this very complicated situation. I mean, yeah, it's always interesting, but the idea that we should like this, I mean, talking about it being interesting also sounds a bit like it's exciting to talk about it, but I think we want to go beyond that and really make sure that we remember this failure as something important rather than interesting to us as an outsider, I think.
Yeah. Okay, I have yet another question. I see that Poria didn't type her question in the Q&A, which is a pity, I think, because with regard to the multiple voices, that is so typical for failed architecture. There are not many voices in the game right now. Another question that I had is that you said there were certain kind of groups of topics that emerge. For instance, you talked about Building Workers Unite, which addresses a certain aspect of architectural production. How do these, since you have this kind of horizontal structure, or at least are striving to have this horizontal structure, how do these things pop up, basically? And how do you manage to kind of structure that? Because, yeah, that.
Yeah, so there's quite an elaborate, like, let's say, background system in which people can like pitch all kinds of proposals and people discuss them, and then at some point like there's like this sense whether people like it or not, and then it's being accepted. And I think in general this process is being facilitated by the organizers. So these three organizers that have this central role, and by now on December 1st, I also stopped being one of the organizers. So we have like three completely new organizers at this moment. And they, when it's necessary, they can also push for certain decisions. So they say like, hey, we're going to do this, or we're not going to do it. And I think in case of this Building Workers Unite, people are kind of excited about this, this idea, by not just scratching behind, let's say, the labor process behind architecture. And then the multiplicity of the voices comes in when other people can contribute their own things to this special series. So people can make podcasts or articles or do interviews. So then there's a wide range of different reflections on this specific topic.
Okay, there is this question now that was typed from Poria. Thank you for the presentation. I will read it. So that thank you for the presentation. Going back to your discussion about optimism, which I am not sure that we already discussed that, but the idea of failed architecture is kind of providing an antithesis to the who mainstream of architecture, and then it stops.
It's missing a
Yeah,
little
I
bit.
think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ah,
Sorry
oh,
for so many inconsistency in technological aspect. Yeah, my question was, first of all, thank you. And I'm really interested in your project, especially a philosophical framework that it introduced. And my question concerns the idea of optimism, which is, I understand failed architecture as kind of an antithesis to what's going on in our mainstream architectural professional world, or even in our schools. So this is a chance for synthesizing something new, maybe toward a kind of a progress. That's when optimism makes sense for me, that we are conceiving a kind of a progress. But my question was, are we seeing a final point or imagining it? Like there is a certain point in future that there won't be a need for a failed architecture anymore, or this is a constant thing that will go on as long as we humans are around?
Yeah, I think the latter, right? I mean, there is always a need for a killjoy in the end, and I think we want to take that position very serious. So, I mean, yeah, let's hope certain things improve. Architecture as a profession improves. Certain power dynamics and economic structures improve in a way that are maybe more equal and just. There would be maybe less need for field architecture to exist. But I think in the end, I think that's really important in a democracy, that there is always opposition, and in culture that there is always criticism, right? There is always a reflection, and yeah, people trying to connect the dots and hold up a mirror. So I think in the end it will there will be a need for it in any case.
Thank you.
You made me think about another question. So thank you. Do you still have the energy to go into
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Because there was this kind of mentioning of the schools. In the beginning, you talked about the workshops that you did with students.
Yeah.
And then you talked about the imagery, the way in which the kind of certain views on architectures kind of get to dominate the whole practice, or at least kind of become these kind of examples that many strive for. Do you have an opinion on how this kind of killjoy attitude and the kind of breaking of this kind of idol architecture thing, how it can be introduced within architectural education? It's a difficult question, I guess, but
yeah, I mean, we know it's already being read a lot in schools and universities, and we know it's also often part of the curriculum to actually read it, to read some of the articles and engage with some of the perspectives. And what we hope, I think, is that architecture students also, maybe like ask themselves twice before they engage in this kind of specific form of spatial production, right? Which is contemporary architecture. Is that something you would like to be part of? And are there maybe, or would you like to stay outside as a critical outsider, or are there maybe interesting hybrid forms that you kind of engage, but maybe take different pathways or develop different kind of methodologies or ways of working? And but then again, that is something where field architecture stops. I think that is not something that we do, but that is maybe, I think that's for the imagination of the architecture student to develop that themselves, right? But we hope that, let's say, the criticism and the critical attitude inspires more people also to to embody that critical attitude as well, and refrain maybe from like very easily joining this, let's say the rat race that contemporary architecture can be.
Lilith joined also, you know Lilith.
Hey, Lilith.
She has a question. I don't know what question, so we will give the floor to her.
Hey.
Hi both. Super nice lecture, René. Thanks. Thanks, Jerry, for inviting him. I do want to, and just maybe as a conversation, it's not really a question, but it relates back to what was the beginning of your conversation, and that was about this between activism and reflection, and that is something because I am doubting about that a lot. I mean, it's another attitude and it's another mode of operation. But sometimes I think with the reflection, it becomes so quickly criticism, and at some point that is also distancing. So you take a distance, you look at it, and then you criticize. The moment that you do activism or you act, let's say, the moment you act, you can become criticized. So it's a very different mode, and sometimes I think if you do that, then you can also maybe provide a possibility. And I was thinking more about it when you were talking about influence of what you want to do, and then you can imagine that in terms of, let's say, the established architects, you can doubt, are they really, because they're in this mode already. So I think you have a lot of influence on younger audience and younger architects, and like the students who are around here now. And they, of course, what you just said, it's very good to make people think, but maybe it could also be helpful to give modes of operation, to have some tools or some possibilities, create some tools to act. So in between that, and in the beginning you answered it quite, no, we want to stay in this modes, but I want to ask actually why, and how are you reflecting on that, or what are your talks about that between you, because I'm sure you have those kind of talks.
So difficult. I mean, I think it's also easy, right, to just reflect and critique from a distance. You don't implicate yourself in the process, even if you're being an activist that, for example, does a certain campaign. You become an active stakeholder, and we kind of refrain from that. I think we stay on the outside and reflect, and maybe that's and we're actually being criticized for also taking that too easy position, right? Like, for example, in the case of this detention center near Rotterdam Airport, it's easier to write this piece. And people say like, in the end, this is like this is a democratic decision that's being executed by architects, and you can shit on it from the outside, but what is that going to do to like the complex kind of political situations this specific building relates to, right? So I think in that sense, it would be interesting to implicate ourselves more and actually build more of a practice that also relates to these kind of situations, right? But I think at some point we decided that would make field architecture too complicated in the sense that, like, to make it work, we need to remain, let's say, this very specific collective that has this killjoy kind of position. And at the moment you start to become more active in specific kind of projects, or start to develop projects yourself, you also kind of dilute, you're also compromising, which is of course, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but which would also make it difficult to have this specific stance at field architecture. But I think it's something that we are very much interested in our own practices outside of field architecture. So for example, a project that I worked on myself is called Grounded Urban Practices, which is actually a research on a wave of, let's say, over the last 10 years of new kinds of practices that emerged in different spaces, among others, Amsterdam and Rotterdam, where it is like, over the last 10 years, is this new wave of young architects and spatial activists and experts try to do things differently and trying to look for new kinds of methodologies and ways of working that combine new financial and organizational models, trying new forms of activist campaigns. So trying to be part of spatial production in a way that's very different than, let's say, the mechanics of contemporary architecture. So it's something that we are interested in, I think, personally also, but field architecture is going to be this like island of killjoyism. Does this answer a little bit your question?
Yeah, it does. And it's also, I mean, you can also argue that it's, you can say you can cover more ground, because the moment you start intervening, it's also a very long time consuming thing. And now you have more possibilities to look wider maybe and broader and indeed inspire. So.
Yeah, that's also true. We can quickly shift around also and cover more topics. And like, for example, like this, there is now this idea around this Building Workers Unite to actually start a new form of a new union around this, which is then again, like it's a new organizational form. That's something that would exist for a really long time frame, right? So that's a completely different kind of time horizon rather than when you when you publish about things, which has a very specific kind of time frame. But, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Lidette. Thanks for joining.
Maybe, yes, since there are no more questions, one of the last things that I would like to ask you, if some of those who are still present would like to join or participate in one way or another, content-wise in failed architecture, how do they proceed basically to get into the game?
Yeah, so we accept open pitches, so people can write like a short pitch about a topic that they find interesting and that they want to reflect on. I think what is important there is that it's something that's going on now. So we generally don't publish, let's say, historical reflections. So it needs to have a certain urgency now, and it needs to have a critical angle on what's going on. I think these are the two most important things. And from that, then we accept pitches from, in general, like people with a wide range of backgrounds, not necessarily architects, but people interested in reflecting on specific spatial situations. And we especially also prefer, let's say, not like hardcore theory, but also maybe some distance also to very specific situations, trying to get some more, let's say, broader metaphorical reflections as well. And we welcome pitches from everyone. So if somebody wants to publish something, please have a look at it. It's at fieldarchitecture.com/contribute. So you can have a look there. But I'm also very interested if people have specific ideas around how field architecture should or can develop. That would also be interesting to hear if people want to share that now or at another time.
Yes. Good. Maybe we can close for now. I think the conversation is not finished at all. And I would like to continue it at another moment. So I would say thank you to everyone who's still present for joining us, and have a good evening. René, can you stay a few minutes longer in the talk? There was also the mentioning in the chat that next Thursday there is another duo lecture, which is definitely also interesting to attend. Good evening, everyone.
Cool.